I recently purchased the book, The Pizza Bible by Tony Geminani, upon the recommendation of one of our fellow community members, Mike. Thanks, Mike, for the recommendation. I've been reading it. There's some interesting stuff in there. I'm going to be going through over the next few weeks and making his recipes, doing some experiments to compare them, and I'm excited about it. So the first experiment that I did was yeast. Tony says that you always want to use dry yeast over instant yeast. His logic being is that dry yeast ferments slower, and slower is always better in pizza making. And if you've been following me, I've kind of gotten the same results, right? Like a 3-day ferment, a 3-day cold ferment has more flavor than a overnight cold ferment. So I thought I'd give this a try. I just used my stock recipe, an overnight cold ferment, to do a comparison. And I use the same brand of yeast, Fleischmann's instant yeast versus Fleischmann's dry yeast. And the exact same ingredients. Only difference is the yeast. I used dry yeast and I proofed it in hot water. And so I made the 2 dough balls and I put them in the fridge after. So my process is, and I'll put the recipe in the description if any of you are interested. But I mixed the ingredients in the mixer, the stand mixer, and then take it out, let it rest at room temperature for about 30 minutes, shape it, put it in the fridge right afterwards, and then let it sit overnight in the fridge. Take it out, let it warm up at room temperature for about 2 to 3 hours, and then bake it. First, the amounts. You probably know that most recipes that call for dry yeast require more dry yeast than instant yeast and vice versa. And so I looked in this a little bit, and here's the deal. Dry yeast and instant yeast are manufactured the exact same way, other than at the end, they mill the instant yeast up into smaller granules. And so that way the smaller granules get absorbed by the ingredients in the dough a lot easier than larger granules. When you have the larger granules in dry yeast, then you've got to proof it in warm water to let it, to let them out, let them dissolve, and so they can mix in better. And so I was looking at conversion tables, and I saw different numbers out there. Some guys said a 1-to-1 ratio is fine. Others said a 1-to-2 ratio. Others said a 1-to-5 ratio. What I went with was the recommendation on the King Arthur website, because they've given me good information in the past. King Arthur says that instant yeast has a tendency to kind of front load its rise, and then it diminishes after that a little bit. Whereas dry yeast is a more consistent rise over time. And so the way that translates into baking is, if you have a recipe that's calling for a short rise, a lot of bread recipes just only need a 1 hour to 2 hour rise, then true, you got to use more dry yeast than instant yeast. However, for longer ferments, like overnight ones like I'm doing, King Arthur recommended just doing a 1-to-1 ratio, because they say it all equals out in the end. So that's what I did. And everything looked the same. The next day, however, the dough ball with the dry yeast was actually a little bit larger than the one made with the instant yeast when I took it out of the fridge. And it continued to rise faster after I took it out of the fridge, after being in the fridge for, probably 14, 16 hours. And so I actually had to put the dry yeast dough ball back in the fridge for about an hour while the instant yeast one caught up. So that was interesting. When they're both the same size and I got ready to bake them, I couldn't tell the difference in how they felt. They stretched out the same. They smelled the same. I baked them, and here, if you look at this picture, they look like a mirror image of each other, right? They're so identical. They look the same. The rim was the same size. The middle of the pizza was the same thickness. I cut it open, and the rim looked the exact same size and type of air bubbles inside. So appearance was the exact same color on the outside. I tasted them, and I couldn't tell any difference at all from taste or texture or crispiness. They're both really just so good and chewy and crispy. So in a nutshell, I got the exact same results using instant yeast as I did dry yeast. like King Arthur was saying, if you're doing a same day ferment, then it's probably going to be different. But I never really do those. I'm either going to do a one night or 3 night, longer. So that's the results. I'm going to continue to use instant yeast. It's just so much easier. Anything I can do to make, to eliminate steps, save time, I'm going to do it as long as I'm not sacrificing quality, which I'm not. So instant yeast is going to be my go-to yeast, as it has been. I was kind of surprised a little bit. I did kind of think dry yeast would be a little bit different. The rise time was a little bit different, like I mentioned, but I don't really care about that. Like once you get the rise time figured out or accounted for, I just care about the quality. So whether you're going to add a little more yeast and cut down the rise time or vice versa, who cares? Like I'm just looking for the quality. As I'm reading through this book, Tony Gemini, he's a master. He's got multiple restaurants. He's won multiple awards, and I'm not doubting his genius, his pizza making genius. However, my impression is that he's a little bit of an eccentric genius, and he's like an eccentric artist type. And those guys, I think, sometimes get caught up in theory a little more than the practical application. So we'll see. That's my first impression. That's the results of my first experiment with yeast. You're going to see some more experiments coming up soon. We'll see if these theories are really playing out in practice, like he says they are. So I also wanted to mention, if you've been following me, you know that I've been using All Trump's flour for these last couple weeks. I was using King Arthur flour forever, and I finally gave in and bought some All Trump's, 50 pounds worth. What I'm learning is that the All Trump's flour, the dough made from All Trump's, it just inflates so much more than regular bread flour does. And so if you look at my picture here from last week, notice the thickness of the pizza. It's like 10 to 12 millimeters probably. The thing is, I shaped that pizza to the same thickness as I would a King Arthur, but the King Arthur flour created a pizza that was probably half the thickness. If this is 12 millimeters, then King Arthur shaped the same thickness would be about 6 or 7 millimeters, maybe even 5 to 6. This All Trump's flour just totally inflates. And so this time with this experiment with the yeast, I made a special effort to really stretch it out more than I normally would. It resulted in a pizza that's about an inch larger in diameter than it would be if it was with King Arthur flour. You can't really tell from this picture, but that dough is just paper thin. It is so paper thin. And the result is a crust that is about 5 millimeters thick, which is my own personal preference. That's how I like it. That's how Scars does it. Scars has some of my very favorite dough or crust in all of New York, and it's about 4 to 5 millimeters, and this was 4 to 5 millimeters, so I was really, really happy with the results here. So I'm just learning the nuances of All Trump's flour versus regular bread flour. I'll continue to share this with you. Let me know what you think. If you really have any different experiences with dry yeast versus instant yeast, let me know, and we'll talk about it and go from there. Thank you.